They told me, "Burn those paintings, nobody needs them." But hidden in that so-called junk was a Rothko worth $100 million. And I, just an old grandmother, became the only one who could stop the biggest scam an auction house had ever pulled. When I was 62, I thought I'd seen most of what life had to offer. I had already buried my husband, raised my children, and tucked away enough little memories to keep me company in the quiet evenings. My hands were busy enough with knitting and my church bake sales, and I thought the rest of my years would drift along with the familiar comfort of routine. But life has a way of pulling the rug from under your sensible shoes. It began with a letter from a lawyer I'd never met, written on paper that smelled faintly of dust and old files. I almost tossed it aside, thinking it was another one of those fussy estate advertisements that prey on widows. But there it was, clear as day. I was the sole heir to an art gallery. Not a stack of bonds, not a tidy little cottage by the lake, but an art gallery in the city, filled with paintings I had never laid eyes on. The will named me as the inheritor of everything inside. Frames, canvases, and even the building itself. The estimated value? $12 million. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, my cup of tea gone cold beside me, staring at those numbers as though they belonged to someone else's story. I pressed my hand against the paper just to be sure it was real. 12 million. My whole life I'd counted pennies in grocery store aisles, choosing store-brand crackers over the ones in the red box, saving nickels for grandkids' Christmas stockings. And now someone thought I was a woman fit to own $12 million worth of paintings. When the family heard the news, they weren't shy about their disappointment. My eldest, bless his heart, tried to smile politely, but I could see the flicker of irritation in his eyes. My daughter-in-law muttered something about how it would have been more practical if I'd gotten stocks or a piece of land. And my nephew, always quick with opinions he hadn't earned, asked if I knew how much upkeep a gallery cost. "It's just dusty canvases, Aunt Margaret," he said, waving his hand as if he were brushing crumbs from the table. "Nobody wants paintings anymore. They don't put food on the table." I wanted to ask him when he'd last had trouble putting food on his table, but I kept quiet. We drove down together the following week to see the place. The gallery sat on a corner street, the kind of brick building you'd pass 100 times without noticing. Its windows were streaked with city grime, and the brass handle on the front door was cold and heavy when I pulled it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of linseed oil and something older, something that made you want to whisper like a church. Paintings leaned against the walls, stacked 2 or 3 deep, their frames chipped but sturdy. Some canvases were so large they seemed to swallow up the room, colors bleeding into each other in strange, stormy ways. Others were small, almost delicate, their lines so fine they made me lean in close. My family shuffled through as though they were in a thrift store, flipping canvases back and forth with sighs of boredom. My nephew, in particular, couldn't hide his disdain. "Nobody buys this kind of thing anymore," he muttered. "You'd be better off turning this place into a coffee shop." I didn't answer him. Instead, I found myself pausing before a painting that looked like nothing at all. A wash of deep red, almost like dried blood, with a block of black pressed above it. My stomach tightened as I looked at it. Something about that canvas felt alive, as though it had been painted with more than brushes and pigments. But I said nothing. Not yet. That evening, after the family had gone back to their busy lives, I lingered in the gallery alone. The setting sun cast long stripes of light across the dusty floorboards. I pulled out one of the folding chairs, sat down, and listened to the silence pressing in on me. It was in that stillness that I felt the weight of it all. This inheritance wasn't just a gift. It was a responsibility and perhaps a test. Someone had left me this gallery for a reason, though I couldn't yet guess what it was. I thought of my late husband, Harold, who had spent so many evenings talking about painters he'd known when we were young. He'd spoken of color as though it had a soul, of brushstrokes as though they carried secrets. Maybe this gallery wasn't so strange after all. Maybe it was a bridge to a past I hadn't yet understood. I gathered my coat around me, locked the door, and whispered to the empty gallery, "We'll see, won't we?" And so began the inheritance that nobody wanted, except me. If I thought my family's disappointment was plain when I first inherited the gallery, it became a full-blown campaign once they realized I was inclined to keep it. We gathered in my living room one Sunday, the air thick with the smell of pot roast I had left warming in the oven. I had hoped the food might soften their edges. Good gravy and tender potatoes usually did. But that day the meal went untouched. My nephew, James, paced by the fireplace like a lawyer preparing his closing arguments. He was the loudest of the lot, and though he was polite enough to call me Aunt Margaret, his tone carried the condescension of a man who thought his years at business school gave him the right to decide the future of everyone else's property. "Aunt Margaret," he said, stopping in front of me, "it's time we faced facts. Those paintings are worthless. Outdated. Nobody cares about oil on canvas anymore. Buyers want modern things, sleek pieces you can hang in condos or offices. Not dusty relics from the basement of some forgotten gallery." I sipped my tea, letting him finish. He was my late sister's boy, and I remembered him as a toddler, tugging at my skirt with sticky hands. But standing there, puffed up in his expensive jacket, I hardly recognized him. "What do you suggest then, James?" I asked gently. He gave a short laugh as though the answer were obvious. "Burn them. Better to burn everything than to waste money storing it. Nobody will buy this junk. The building maybe, but the canvases? Dead weight." My daughter-in-law nodded in agreement, her lips pressed thin. "He's right, Mother. You'll be throwing good money after bad if you try to keep it going. And frankly, a gallery isn't practical for someone at your stage of life." "At my stage of life?" The words stung more than they should have. One of the younger cousins chimed in with a shrug. "If you sold the building, at least you'd have some cash to put aside for us. It's not like anybody's going to remember the art." The room fell into a chorus of agreement, voices overlapping until they sounded like a flock of crows squabbling over scraps. My nephew leaned forward, lowering his voice as if confiding a secret. "Aunt Margaret, I have contacts at the auction houses. I can take care of everything discreetly. Let me handle it. You'll thank me later." But his words settled in me like a stone in water. "Burn them. Nobody needs paintings." I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, and watched the faces around me. These were people I had held as babies, people I had cooked Sunday dinners for, people whose birthdays I never forgot. And yet, not one of them looked at those canvases and saw what I saw. Not the brushstrokes, not the colors, not the weight of history tucked into each frame. They only saw firewood. I thought of Harold again, my Harold, who used to sit at our kitchen table late into the night, sketching little studies of light and shadow while I mended socks. He wasn't a painter by profession, but he had loved artists, admired them in a way that made me admire him. He had spoken often of his friends who painted for the sheer joy of it, men and women who traded canvases like children traded marbles. I remembered how he once brought home a painting wrapped in brown paper and whispered, "This one has something in it, Maggie. Something alive." Now my family wanted me to strike a match. When the voices in the room grew louder, I cleared my throat, the sound sharper than I intended. The chatter stopped. "Well," I said, steady as I could, "you've all made your opinions known. But I am not burning anything. Not one canvas." James scowled. "Aunt Margaret." "No," I cut him off. "That gallery was entrusted to me, not to you. If it's worth nothing, then it can sit there and gather dust until I decide otherwise. But I will not reduce someone's life's work to ashes." The silence that followed was thick as winter fog. Finally, James shoved his hands into his pockets and muttered, "You're making a mistake." "Perhaps," I said, "but it will be my mistake to make." They left soon after, muttering amongst themselves. Nobody touched the pot roast. I sat alone at the table later, ladling gravy over my own plate, the quiet of the house pressing down like a quilt. That night I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. Doubt crept in with the shadows. Was I clinging to something pointless? Maybe they were right, maybe the canvases were nothing but clutter. But then I remembered the painting that had stopped me in my tracks, that strange block of red and black that made my heart beat faster. There was something there, something I couldn't quite name, and I promised myself as I drifted into uneasy sleep that before I let anyone light a match, I would find out what it was. The morning after that dreadful family meeting, I brewed my coffee stronger than usual. The air still carried the echo of their words. Burn them, worthless, impractical, and I couldn't shake the unease crawling along my spine. I carried my mug into the sitting room, where the winter sun filtered weakly through lace curtains. The walls were quiet, but in my memory, Harold's voice drifted through as clear as if he were sitting across from me. Art lives, Maggie. Even when the artist is gone, even when the world forgets them, the work carries their breath. He'd had a way of saying things like that, making me believe there was more to a painting than pigment and canvas. I remembered how he'd lingered with painters after exhibitions, trading jokes, pressing their hands, listening to their long-winded philosophies as though they were scripture. I'd grown used to the smell of turpentine on his coat, the strange names of pigments tossed into our dinner conversations, cadmium, ochre, ultramarine. And now, sitting there with coffee warming my palms, it struck me. Harold had known people. Real painters, some of whom had gone on to be, what was the word? Celebrated. Could it be possible, I wondered, that some of those canvases in the gallery weren't just forgotten works but something more? Something valuable? I set down my cup with a decisive clink. If Harold had taught me anything, it was that a person ought to trust their instincts, even when the world calls them foolish. So I pulled out my old address book, the one with bent corners and ink smudges from decades of notes. My finger traced familiar names, most of them long gone now. But one caught my eye, Professor Lawrence Whitaker. He wasn't a professor anymore, at least not formally. Back in the day, he'd lectured on modern art at the university where Harold sometimes attended talks. I remembered Lawrence well. A tall, bespectacled man with a habit of pushing his glasses up when he was about to say something clever. He had visited our home once for supper, years ago, and I remembered the way he'd paused in front of Harold's modest sketch pinned above the mantel. "The hand knows more than the mind, you see," he'd murmured. I hadn't spoken to him in decades, but rumor had it he'd become something of a respected art historian, still active despite his age. My hand trembled slightly as I dialed the number scribbled in fading ink. To my astonishment, the line clicked, and a deep, familiar voice answered. "Whitaker. Lawrence? This is Margaret Ellis, Harold's widow. I don't know if you remember me." There was a pause, then warmth seeped into his tone. "Margaret. Good heavens, of course I remember you. Harold was a fine man. How long has it been?" "Too long," I admitted softly. "Lawrence, I've inherited an art gallery. A small one. The family insists the collection is worthless, but I have my doubts. Would you be willing to take a look?" There was another pause, filled with the faint scratch of pen on paper. Then, "I would be delighted. Send me the address and I'll arrange a visit. But Margaret," his voice dropped a little, "don't let anyone move a single canvas until I've seen them." When I hung up the phone, relief and dread tangled in my chest. What if he found nothing? What if the family had been right all along, and I was clinging to Harold's ghosts? But there was also hope. A stubborn little flame that refused to go out. The following Thursday, I met Lawrence at the gallery. He arrived in a long coat, a scarf tucked neatly under his chin, his hair white as chalk but his stride still brisk. When he stepped inside, he removed his glasses, polished them with a handkerchief, and put them back on as though preparing to read scripture. "Well," he said, surveying the stacked canvases, "let's see what ghosts Harold left you." We spent hours pulling canvases from their dusty resting places. He examined each one with a meticulous eye, murmuring about brushstrokes, pigments, and provenance. I followed him like a schoolgirl, eager and nervous, though I hardly understood half of what he said. At one point, he paused before a canvas of swirling blue and green, his breath catching. This is interesting. Very interesting. See here? The layering, the pigment. It's unusual. Not what you'd expect from a hobbyist." I leaned closer, squinting. To me it looked like nothing more than a storm at sea, waves crashing against some invisible shore. But Lawrence touched the corner lightly, as though it were a living thing. "Margaret," he said slowly, "this warrants further study. You may have more here than anyone realizes." My heart thudded in my chest. I thought of James, of his smug insistence that these canvases were nothing but fuel for a bonfire. I thought of the others, eager to cash out, dismissing the gallery as a burden. And I thought of Harold, who had once told me that art was simply truth wearing its Sunday best. For the first time in weeks I allowed myself to smile. "Then let's study it, Lawrence," I said. "Let's study them all." That night, as I locked the gallery door, I whispered a quiet promise into the dusky air. "I will protect this place. I will protect Harold's legacy, and I will not let them turn it into ash." When Lawrence came back a week later, he brought with him a leather satchel worn smooth with age and filled with instruments I'd never seen before. Brushes of different sizes, little glass vials, a portable lamp, even a small magnifying glass that looked straight out of a detective novel. "We'll need good light," he said, wheeling one of the larger canvases onto an easel in the gallery. Dust puffed into the air as though the painting itself was waking from a long sleep. I busied myself with the kettle in the corner. Tea always steadied my nerves, but I couldn't help hovering near him, watching every movement. He adjusted the lamp, leaned close to the canvas, then pulled out what looked like a tiny scraper. "This," he said, "will tell us more than signatures or stories ever could." He scraped gently, collecting the thinnest of shavings into a vial, then held it under the light. "Pigment," he explained. "Every decade, every painter, sometimes every studio had different recipes. Some colors don't exist anymore, not in the same way. If this matches certain known pigments, well, we'll have something to talk about." I folded my hands to keep them from trembling. "And if it doesn't? Then you'll have a pretty canvas and nothing more." His tone was kind but firm. "But my instincts tell me otherwise." He worked in silence for a long while, sometimes muttering under his breath. I sipped my tea and let the tick of the gallery clock fill the quiet. At last, he leaned back, his expression more animated than I'd ever seen it. "Margaret," he said, tapping the canvas with the side of his finger, "do you see these fields of red? The way the black presses against it? This isn't decorative. This is emotional. And the pigment, it's consistent with a type used in the 1950s, very particular, very rare. You don't find it on student works. This was done by a hand that knew exactly what it wanted." I stepped closer. The painting was simple, just blocks of color, red bleeding into black, but the longer I looked, the more it pulled at me. It was as though the canvas was humming quietly, a note I couldn't hear but felt deep in my chest. "Lawrence," I whispered, "what are you saying?" He pressed his glasses higher on his nose. "I'm saying there's a real chance, though I'll need further analysis, that this could be an authentic Mark Rothko." I blinked at him. The name was familiar, though I couldn't place why. "And is that good?" He laughed, a soft, delighted sound. "Good, Margaret. If this is authentic, it's not just good. It could be worth more than the entire gallery. Tens of millions. One painting." My knees nearly gave out, and I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. I thought of James smirking as he told me to burn the lot. I thought of my daughter-in-law's dismissive sighs. Worthless. Dusty. Better as kindling. And here was Lawrence telling me one of these canvases might be worth more than I could even fathom. But we must be cautious, he continued, his voice lowering. Rothko's works are heavily documented, and the art world is filled with fakes. We'll need provenance, proof of ownership, chemical analysis. It's a long road. I nodded, though my mind was already racing back through memories. Harold at the kitchen table, laughing with a man whose hands were stained with paint. Late-night conversations I had only half listened to. Names drifting through the air like smoke. De Kooning, Pollock, Rothko. Had Harold? I pressed a hand to my chest. If Harold had truly been given such a gift, why had he never spoken of it? Or had he, and I simply hadn't understood? Lawrence must have seen the questions in my face. He touched my arm gently. Do you remember your husband mentioning Rothko? I searched my memory, but it was like trying to catch water in my hands. I remember evenings. Cigarette smoke, wine, laughter. Men talking about color as though it were religion. But I never paid much attention. I thought it was just Harold's way of keeping company. Sometimes, Lawrence said, the greatest treasures hide in plain sight. The gallery seemed to breathe around us, the canvases leaning against the walls like silent witnesses. I looked at them differently now, not as burdens or clutter, but as possible secrets waiting for someone to listen. When Lawrence finally left, promising to take his samples to a lab, I locked the gallery and stood alone in the fading light. The red and black painting glowed faintly in the twilight, as though holding its own fire. I whispered to it, feeling half foolish. Are you the reason he left this all to me? That night sleep eluded me. I wandered the house, Harold's old journals spread across the kitchen table, searching for a clue I wasn't sure existed. In one I found a note in his handwriting, smudged but legible. True art isn't owned. It's carried. Protect it. I pressed the page to my chest, tears slipping down my cheeks. For the first time since inheriting the gallery, I felt not burdened but chosen. The morning Lawrence was due to return. I awoke with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. The gallery no longer seemed like a burden but like a chest of secrets, waiting to be opened. I baked a batch of lemon muffins. I always find serious conversations go down easier with something sweet, and carried them in a tin under my arm as I set off. The key turned in the gallery door with its usual stubborn creak, but the silence inside felt different. Not the hushed stillness of waiting, but emptier, hollower, like a room that had been disturbed. I frowned and set the tin down on the front desk. When Lawrence arrived, bustling in with his scarf flapping, I nearly sighed in relief. But his keen eyes noticed the same thing I had. Margaret, he said softly, scanning the walls. Weren't there more canvases stacked here? My stomach dropped. The corner where we'd piled several of the larger works was bare, save for a faint rectangle of dust. I hurried to the storage room, heart pounding. Shelves that had been crowded just last week now gaped with spaces. I counted once, then twice, my hands shaking. Lawrence, I whispered. Half a dozen at least. Gone. He followed me in, his brow furrowed. Who else has a key? The question was simple, but the answer knifed through me. Only myself and James. My nephew had insisted on keeping a copy, saying it was for emergencies, and in case the building inspector needed access. Fool that I was, I'd agreed. After all, he was family. Now my mind replayed his words at the family meeting. Burn them. Nobody needs paintings. But maybe fire hadn't been his plan at all. Maybe something worse. Lawrence crouched to examine the floor. No sign of forced entry. Whoever it was, they knew exactly what they wanted. I clutched the edge of a shelf, anger pushing through the fog of disbelief. That boy, I muttered. That boy and his smooth talk. I should have known. Lawrence straightened, his face grave. Margaret, if he's taken them, you need to act quickly. Stolen art has a way of vanishing, reappearing under false names, swapped forgeries sold quietly overseas. Once they slip away, they're nearly impossible to trace. The room spun around me. Just days ago, these paintings had been dismissed as worthless, and now they were being plucked away like treasure in the night. I marched back into the front hall, pulled out my phone and called James. He answered on the second ring, his voice slick with cheer. "Aunt Margaret, how's my favorite lady today?" "James," I said, steadying my voice, "did you take anything from the gallery?" There was the briefest pause, just enough to confirm what I already knew. Then he laughed. "What? Of course not. Why on earth would I want those dusty things?" "Because 6 are missing," I snapped. "And you're the only other one with a key." His voice cooled. "Now, Aunt Margaret, let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe you misplaced them. Or maybe your historian friend is rearranging things without telling you. You're getting on in years after all. Memory slips." The condescension in his tone boiled my blood. I bit down on my reply, ending the call before I said something I couldn't take back. Lawrence watched me with quiet sympathy. "We'll find them," he said, though doubt clouded his eyes. That night I couldn't bring myself to go home. I dragged an old armchair into the gallery and sat watch beside the red and black painting, as though guarding it with my presence alone. The shadows lengthened, and the building creaked like an old ship at sea. Somewhere beyond the glass, the city bustled, unaware of the small war being waged in this forgotten corner. I thought of Harold again. Would he have trusted James? Would he have left the gallery to me knowing this storm would brew? Or had he trusted me to see it through, come what may? By dawn my eyes burned from lack of sleep, but my resolve was sharp as a blade. James had crossed a line. Family or not, I would not sit idle while he treated Harold's legacy like poker chips at a casino. When I arrived home later, the phone was already ringing. I lifted the receiver, expecting Lawrence. Instead, it was my neighbor, Mrs. Keating, her voice crackling with excitement. "Margaret, have you seen the newspaper? Big auction coming up downtown. Newly discovered collection, they're calling it. Front page of the arts section." My blood froze. I snatched the paper from my porch and spread it on the table. There they were, bold as brass. Photographs of the very canvases that had vanished. Only they weren't quite right. The colors looked off, the lines too stiff. Forgeries. Clever ones, but fakes nonetheless. And beneath the images, the article gushed about a nephew of a distinguished family who had brokered the discovery. "James." I pressed my trembling hand to my lips. My worst fear had unfolded faster than I dared imagine. The stolen works were already parading toward an auction block, their fakes ready to deceive wealthy buyers, while the real paintings were being spirited away. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, the paper crackling under my fingers. The muffins I baked for Lawrence still sat untouched, their sweet scent mocking the bitter taste in my mouth. This wasn't just theft. This was betrayal, written in bold ink for the world to see. And in that moment I knew the fight had only just begun. The morning the newspaper announced that auction, I sat with the article spread across my kitchen table, the print blurring where my tears had fallen. Betrayal burns, but it burns hottest when it comes from blood. My nephew James hadn't just stolen from me, he'd stolen from Harold. From the memory of nights filled with paint-stained laughter, from friendships sealed in brushstrokes. But as I looked closer at the photographs, something stirred in me. The canvases were mine, yes, but not quite. The reds were too flat, the blacks too heavy-handed, the brushstrokes mechanical where they should have been alive. They were clever copies, but fakes all the same. I carried the paper straight to Lawrence. He opened the door with ink smudged on his fingers, his hair sticking out from too much thought. When he saw the article, his face darkened. "Ah," he muttered, scanning the images. "I was afraid of this. Forgeries." You can tell. I asked, my voice thin. He pointed to the margins. Here, the layering is wrong. And look, the proportions are slightly altered. Whoever painted these was skilled but not brilliant. They're imitations, not originals. My stomach twisted. Then where are the real ones? Likely already on their way out of the country, he said grimly. That's how these schemes work. They sell the fakes locally, build a story, and quietly funnel the authentic works to private buyers overseas. By the time the truth comes out, if it ever does, the originals are locked away in vaults and the trail is cold. I sat down heavily. And James is part of this? Lawrence gave me a long look. The article mentions a nephew of a prominent family facilitating the sale. That's not coincidence. He's working with someone who knows the game, likely someone high up at that auction house. The thought made me shiver. This wasn't just my nephew's greed anymore. This was a web and I was standing right in the middle of it. But despair gave way to anger, and anger hardened into resolve. I wasn't going to let Harold's legacy be smuggled away in shadows. Not while I still drew breath. That week, the city buzzed with talk of the auction. Reporters hailed the remarkable find. Buyers whispered of hidden gems ready to surface. I kept my head down, but every word I overheard only stoked the fire in me. At church on Sunday, Mrs. Keating leaned close after service, her perfume sweet and heavy. Margaret, are you going to bid on anything? Wouldn't it be something if you ended up buying one of your own paintings back? I forced a smile. We'll see, dear. We'll see. What I didn't say was that the very thought made my stomach turn. Buying back what was already mine would be a final humiliation. No, I needed something stronger than money. I needed truth. Lawrence and I began preparing. He gathered his notes, his pigment samples, and letters of authentication he'd collected over the years. I dug through Harold's old journals, searching for any scrap that might prove provenance. Names, dates, even scribbled notes about who had painted what. One night, long after midnight, I found a line in Harold's looping handwriting. Dinner with Mark, spoke of painting as if it were prayer. He left me a gift. Said it would keep the house warm when he was gone. Mark. Rothko. My hand shook as I traced the ink. There it was, proof, fragile but real, that Harold had known him. That the painting was no accident. The night before the auction I hardly slept. I laid out my dress carefully. A navy blue one I'd kept for funerals and weddings, pressed it until every crease lay flat. I polished my shoes. I even set aside the old brooch Harold had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to walk into that room not as an old woman fussed over by greedy relatives, but as the rightful guardian of a legacy. The morning of, I brewed tea but left it untouched. My nerves hummed like wires. Lawrence met me outside the auction house, his satchel bulging with papers, his expression taut with determination. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with wealth. Men in tailored suits, women dripping in jewels, voices low and eager. The paintings hung along the walls, spotlights gleaming off their false faces. My heart lurched. They looked like mine, but I knew better now. They were imposters dressed in stolen clothes. And at the front of the room, smiling with a confidence that made me want to slap him, stood James. My nephew. My betrayer. The auctioneer tapped his gavel. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Today we present a newly discovered collection of extraordinary value. I sat straighter, my hands folded tightly in my lap. This was no longer just about paintings. It was about truth, family, and the quiet strength of a promise I'd once made to Harold, to protect what mattered. And before the day was done, I intended to keep it. The auction had barely begun when I understood. This was bigger than James. My nephew might have been reckless enough to think he could pull off such a scheme, but he wasn't clever enough to orchestrate it. No, there was someone else behind the curtain, pulling the strings with gloved hands. It didn't take long for me to spot him. The director of the auction house himself, Mr. Alcott, a man with a reputation for charm as polished as his cufflinks. He strolled through the crowd, shaking hands, whispering promises, his smile as smooth as cream. When his eyes landed on James, there was an understanding glance between them, brief but unmistakable. My stomach tightened. I leaned toward Lawrence, who sat beside me. "There," I whispered, nodding toward Alcott. "That's the man feeding my nephew his confidence." Lawrence's jaw set. I've suspected him before. Too many discoveries passing through his hands. But proving collusion. He trailed off, adjusting his glasses. As the first lot was unveiled, the room buzzed. Wealthy bidders raised their paddles, the auctioneer's voice climbing higher, numbers leaping like firecrackers. The canvas on display was one of mine, or rather, one of the forgeries. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails pressed crescents into my palms. The painting sold for $500,000. Applause rippled through the crowd. James beamed, basking in the glow as though he'd painted the thing himself. My heart ached, not just from betrayal but from the sight of a boy I'd once rocked to sleep, now playing the role of a thief. When the bidding paused for refreshments, I rose quietly and slipped into the hall. The air outside the chamber felt cooler, easier to breathe. And that's when I overheard it. Two men talking near the side entrance, one of them unmistakably James. "Originals are already shipped," he muttered, his voice low but urgent. "No risk now. These fakes will keep the story alive." The other man replied with a clipped accent I didn't recognize. "Keep your aunt quiet, and your share will be safe. If she stirs trouble, we cut you out." My breath caught. There it was, confirmation. The originals weren't gone yet, but already on their way. Smuggled overseas, hidden beyond reach. I ducked back into the main room before James could spot me, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I returned to my seat, Lawrence noticed the color in my face. "What is it?" he asked. "They're moving the real paintings abroad," I whispered. "And James knows it." His eyes narrowed. "Then we must act quickly. Once they leave the country, they'll vanish into private collections. You'll never see them again." I thought of Harold, how he had believed in art as a shared light, not a hidden treasure. The thought of those canvases locked away in some vault, never to be seen again, filled me with a fury I hadn't felt in decades. The second half of the auction resumed, but I heard little of it. My mind raced with what I'd overheard. Alcott and James weren't just trying to cheat buyers. They were playing a double game, selling forgeries for headlines while sneaking the true works out the back door. When James walked to the podium to thank the audience for their support, his voice smooth and confident, I rose without thinking. My chair scraped loudly against the floor, turning heads. "Margaret," Lawrence hissed, tugging at my sleeve. "Not yet." But my body had already decided. I walked out of the hall, my steps steady, and made for the quiet room at the back where staff bustled between lots. Sure enough, I caught a glimpse of crates being loaded onto a dolly, each one stenciled with the gallery's storage numbers. My gallery. A young assistant nearly bumped into me, his eyes wide. "Ma'am, you can't be back here." "I can," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "Those belong to me." Before he could argue, Mr. Alcott himself appeared, his smile as slick as oil. "Ah, Mrs. Ellis. What a pleasure. I hope you're enjoying the proceedings." I stared at the crates, then back at him. "Those are my paintings." He chuckled softly, as though humoring a confused old woman. No, these are newly consigned works. Verified, documented." "Forged?" I interrupted, my voice carrying sharper than I intended. "And the originals are already leaving this country under your watch." His smile faltered only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Behind me, Lawrence's voice rang out, calm but commanding. "I have pigment samples that prove these are imitations, and witnesses who will testify." For a moment, The air hung heavy with tension. Then Alcott smoothed his face again, as if nothing had been said. "You must be mistaken. Why don't we step into my office and discuss this privately?" But I'd had enough of secrets whispered in corners. I turned on my heel, my mind already racing toward the next step. The world needed to hear the truth. Not in an office, not in a hushed hallway, but out in the open. And if it cost me every ounce of strength I had left, that was exactly what I was going to do. The night after the auction, I couldn't sleep. My body was tired, but my mind raced like a train I couldn't get off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James's smug face, Alcott's oily smile, and those crates rolling out the back door. I returned to the gallery the next morning, determined to gather whatever proof I could before confronting them publicly. The place was quiet, dust motes drifting through the sunlight like tiny ghosts. I walked slowly between the canvases, my fingers trailing along the frames, as though Harold's handprints might still linger there. One frame in particular caught my attention. It was an unassuming piece, nothing grand, just a muted landscape, hills rolling under a gray sky. But the frame itself was loose, the backing a little warped from age. Instinct made me press gently, and to my surprise the corner popped open. Curiosity pushed me further. I tugged, and the backing came free, releasing a small envelope that slipped into my hands. It was yellowed, the edges brittle, but Harold's handwriting leapt out at me instantly. My breath caught in my throat. I sat down right there on the floor and opened it carefully, my hands trembling. Inside was a folded letter, written in his familiar looping script. "To Margaret, if you ever come to hold these works, remember they were gifts, not commodities. Each one carries a story. Mark gave me his canvas after a night of too much wine. He said he'd rather it live with a family than sit unseen in a studio. Others came from friends, tokens of love and trust. Keep them safe, Maggie. One day they'll mean more than money." I pressed the letter to my chest, tears spilling freely. My Harold, always more sentimental than practical, always believing in the soul of things rather than their price. And now here was proof. Not just of ownership but of provenance, evidence that some of these works, including the Rothko, had come directly from the artists themselves. For the first time since James's betrayal, I felt not powerless but armed. The letter was more than words. It was testimony, straight from the hand of the man who had known those painters, loved them, and been entrusted by them. I tucked the envelope into my handbag, holding it as though it were made of gold. Perhaps in its way it was worth even more. When I met Lawrence later that day and showed him, his eyes widened. "Margaret," he said softly, this changes everything. This is provenance. This is history in your hands." And for the first time in weeks I smiled. A real smile, not forced, not trembling. Harold had left me not only the gallery, but the key to defending it. And come the next auction, the world would see the truth. Lawrence met me on the steps, his satchel heavy with pigment samples, photographs, and decades of expertise. I carried only my handbag, but tucked inside, wrapped in a silk handkerchief, was Harold's letter. My hands kept straying to it, as though touching the paper could give me strength. The auction house was crowded, reporters buzzing at the edges, buyers chattering in low, eager tones. Spotlights gleamed off the canvases on display, the forgeries dressed in their counterfeit finery. My heart hammered, but my stride did not falter. When the auctioneer tapped his gavel and the bidding began, I rose to my feet. My voice carried sharper than I expected, cutting through the hum of money and anticipation. "Stop this farce," I said. Heads turned. A murmur rippled through the room. The auctioneer faltered mid-sentence, blinking at me as though I were some mad intruder. James, standing near the front, went pale then red. "Aunt Margaret, sit down," he hissed. But I did not sit. I walked straight to the platform, my shoes clicking firmly against the polished floor. Lawrence joined me, laying his documents on the table with quiet precision. These paintings, I said, sweeping my hand toward the walls, are fakes. Clever, yes, but forgeries nonetheless. The real works have been stolen, smuggled overseas by this very house, with the help of my nephew. Gasps filled the room. Cameras flashed. James sputtered, his practice charm cracking. She's delusional, he snapped. Old confused. Am I? I pulled Harold's letter from my bag and held it high. This is my husband's hand, dated decades ago. He names the artists, he explains the gifts. This Rothko, I gestured toward the red and black canvas Lawrence had authenticated, was entrusted to him personally, and here in writing is proof. Lawrence stepped forward then, his voice calm and authoritative. I have pigment samples confirming these so-called discoveries are modern imitations. The originals are missing, and the provenance provided today is fraudulent. This is a coordinated act of deception. The room erupted, reporters shouting questions, buyers demanding answers. The auctioneer tried to bang his gavel for order, but the clamor only grew. Mr. Alcott, the director, strode forward, his smile tight as wire. Mrs. Ellis, he said smoothly, you're making serious accusations. Without evidence. This is evidence. I cut him off, holding the letter toward the nearest reporter. The cameras zoomed in, lenses hungry for scandal. And there's more. Photographs, records, pigment analysis. All of it proves these works are forged, and the originals are being hidden. My nephew thought he could sell off Harold's legacy, but today the truth comes to light. James lunged forward, his face twisted with fury. You're ruining everything, he shouted. No, I said quietly but firmly. You ruined it yourself the moment you chose greed over family. The reporters swarmed him then, their microphones thrust like spears. Alcott tried to retreat, but flashes followed him, questions hurled like stones. Buyers began demanding refunds, voices rising in outrage. The auction unraveled before my eyes, the grand performance collapsing into chaos. And through it all I stood steady, Harold's letter clutched in my hands. My heart was pounding, my knees weak, but I did not waver. By the time the authorities arrived, James was cornered, Alcott pale and sweating. Lawrence gave his statement with precision. I handed over the letter for safekeeping, and the press had already written the headline, Elderly Widow Exposes Art Fraud at Auction House. When it was done, and the hall emptied of its chaos, I stood alone for a moment in the quiet. The false canvases still hung on the walls, hollow imitations of the treasures Harold's friends had once given him. But I knew deep in my bones that the truth was stronger than any forgery. I touched the brooch at my collar, whispering to the memory of Harold, we did it. In the weeks that followed, my world turned upside down. The newspapers couldn't print the story fast enough. An old widow exposing an auction house scandal was the kind of drama they lived for. Reporters camped outside my front gate, calling questions as though I were some celebrity. I waved them off, preferring my tea and quiet mornings, but I'll admit, there was a certain satisfaction in knowing the truth had traveled farther than James's lies ever could. The law moved slower than the press, but it moved. James was charged with fraud and conspiracy. I still remember seeing him in court. His head hung low, no trace of the bravado that once filled my living room with talk of burning paintings. He looked small, like the boy I once held by the hand crossing the street, but I couldn't let that soften me. Choices have consequences. As for Alcott, the mighty director, his empire crumbled overnight. Buyers pulled their trust, his partners vanished, and soon enough, he too was facing trial. Greed, it turns out, is not nearly as clever as it thinks it is. And me? I kept the gallery. Not as a business venture. I had no interest in chasing profits or currying favor with collectors, but as a promise fulfilled. With Lawrence's help, I cataloged every canvas, each one carefully preserved and documented. The Rothko especially we treated like a crown jewel, though I found myself visiting it less for its value and more for the quiet comfort it gave me. Its colors no longer felt foreboding, but protective, like a sentinel standing guard over the rest. In time I made a decision. The gallery would become a foundation, a place not for moneyed collectors, but for children, students, anyone curious enough to stand before a canvas and wonder. Art, Harold always said, was meant to breathe, not hide. So we opened the doors free of charge, and filled the halls not only with paintings but with Harold's story, and now mine too. Some evenings, when the last visitor has gone and the lights are dimmed, I walk the gallery alone. My steps echo on the old wood floors and I think of Harold. I imagine him smiling, proud that his friends' gifts are still alive, still speaking to anyone willing to listen. Legacy, I've learned, isn't just about what you leave behind. It's about what you protect, what you fight for, even when the world calls you foolish. And so I keep the gallery, not for wealth, not for pride, but for love, and for the promise of one red and black painting that still hums softly in the quiet, as if Harold himself is there, keeping watch with me. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.